Hey everyone. Uh I'm recording this after I watched episode 8 of RWBY Volume 9 and oh my god. I almost didn't want to even sit down and record this because I wanted to get straight into talking about episode 8. However, I am still going to record this and do the review for episode 7, and then I'm immediately jumping into doing the review for episode 8. If I work fast enough, I may even get it out today. Who knows? If not, it'll probably be either Sunday or Monday. We'll just have to see. But yeah, I do talk about it a couple times here in this episode or in this review. So you've been warned. No major spoilers or anything, but I will probably bring it up every now and then because yeah, that's living rent free in my head right now. Anyway, let's get into the actual review for episode 7. Episode 7 was a hell of a thing, huh? So much so, in fact, that I'm going to change up how I'm doing the review today. Rather than going through and breaking down the episode from start to finish, I want to focus on a few key things in this episode. Namely, the paper pleasers, Jean, RWBY, and their argument at the end of the episode. Before we get to it though, I'd like to thank everyone who has subscribed so far. As of the making of this video, we are sitting at over 300 subscribers. My goal is to have 1,000 by the end of the year, so if you aren't subscribed, then please consider doing so for more content going forward, as well as liking this video to help it reach more people and earn the favor of the mighty YouTube algorithm, to which we are all but lowly peons. First, I give this episode a solid 8.5 out of 10. This one's been coming for a long time now, and the twin breakdowns of RWBY and Jean were delivered perfectly as far as I'm concerned. I do have one issue, but that's more of a problem with the overall pacing of the volume, rather than this episode specifically. In fact, let's tackle that first since I brought it up. Volume 9 is, as we all know, a shorter volume, sitting at only 10 episodes with an average runtime of about 18 minutes. Now, the runtime is about average for what we can expect of an episode of RWBY, however, the number of episodes is noticeably shorter than what we're used to. Until Volume 9, every episode of RWBY had at least 12 episodes. Volume 8 had 14. So for Volume 9 to have the fewest number of episodes yet without a longer than average runtime, so far I think they've done a good job with pacing for the most part, but we now only have 3 episodes left in the volume, and more people are starting to think that the Ever After arc could continue into Volume 10, and I've previously held that I think they'll be returning to Remnant by the end of this volume, but I am less sure of that now. Because as things stand, they have a lot left to tackle with just 3 episodes. RWBY and Jean's issues and traumas, finding Ruby now that she's run off, resolving the conflict in Neo one way or another, addressing the very obvious hints of Summer in some way, shape, or form, possibly being in the Ever After, and of course, going home. That's a lot to squeeze into 3 episodes, assuming they're going to be roughly the same length as the other episodes so far. Now, if these next 3 episodes are significantly longer, say 25 to 30 minutes, then I think runtime will be less of an issue, but I don't see that happening. Hopefully I'm wrong, but there's only one way to find out. And spoiler alert, I was wrong, at least about episode 8. And I think this episode is the first time we saw that shorter volume length impact the episode and the story. To be specific, I am talking about how the situation with the paper pleasers was resolved. Namely, the resolution wasn't due to anything that Team RWBY or Jean did. The paper pleasers were finally able to ascend because the Jabberwockers attacked, and as a result, Team RWBY and Jean were focused on fighting them and couldn't stop the paper pleasers from toppling the Pebble Tower. Rather than Jean being given the chance to come to terms with the fact that they wanted to go to the tree, that they were ready to ascend, it just kind of happened. And just added something else to the pile of loss and trauma that Jean has had heaped on him since the end of Volume 8. Which I do think works in the episode with the length of it and everything else that happened afterwards, but if the episode had been longer, or if the volume just had more episodes in it, then they could have resolved the situation in a better way, at least in my opinion. If they'd had the time, Team RWBY could have talked to Jean, helped him see that while his intentions were good, he was keeping the paper pleasers from being reborn now that their task was complete. And previously I've said that my main issue with Ascension is the lack of choice in it, but in this case the paper pleasers want to be remade. They're ready for it. So in my personal opinion, Ascension is, in this case, not a bad thing. Of course, Jean didn't see it that way. He was completely obsessed with protecting them from any harm, including from themselves. And it was clearly taking a toll on him. He was trying to do too much on his own, and it stretched him thin. Eventually, something was going to break. Frankly, the fact that he kept a village of people made of paper alive as long as he did is kind of a miracle, but one way or another, it was going to blow up in his face if his need to keep them safe wasn't addressed. And before the Jabberwockers showed up, it was being addressed. Team RWBY was getting to the core of Jean's emotional burden and why he was so obsessed with protecting these people. Because he could do it. Because he could keep them safe. After he not only couldn't keep Penny safe, but took her life by her own request. She asked him to do it, to trust her, and he did it. And now Jean finds himself in a village of paper lemmings that are more or less asking him to do the exact same thing. To let them die. And yes, it is a different situation than with Penny, since they will ascend and won't just come to a permanent end, but still, Jean can't accept that, and after everything that's happened to him, well, of course he can't. After losing Pyrrha and failing to protect Penny, letting the paper pleasers die, who, by the way, nursed him back to health after Alex poisoned him, runs completely counter to everything Jean is about, and is basically a slap in the face for him. And he didn't have anyone who understood what he's been through to talk to help him through his emotional turmoil until Team RWBY arrived. And as we saw, they were making headway pretty quickly now that they were here. Well, that turned into a rant about Jean, but I suppose that's to be expected. So much of this episode highlighted how much he's been through and how roughly the Ever After has treated him. And we'll have even more to say about him because this was kind of the Jean episode. But moving on, let's talk about the Paper Pleasers, or at least talk about what little I haven't said in regards to them at this point. The Paper Pleasers do not resent or hate Jean for stopping them from ascending. Much like how their purpose is to serve the land they live on and those they meet, they simply viewed Jean stopping them from ascending as completing his purpose, protecting others. And there were actual threats Jean kept them safe from, outside of themselves. The Jabberwocker, of course, is the big one, and we know from Jean's map that the Paper Pleaser's acre is right next to the Walkers, so he almost certainly had to fight it more than once. If nothing else, he's clearly kept his skills sharp and kept himself in shape, and his armor is more than just rusted. You can see scratches across his armor and his shield, which shows that, yes, he's had more than a few fights with the Jabberwocker. Then there's other, almost certainly less dangerous, threats. The giant crows that seem to attack the papers scare crows in fields, the bandits, some kind of shredder, though I don't know if that was another of the paper's ascension attempts or some creature that could shred them, and of course, the goose. I wish we could have seen the goose make an appearance. So outside of stopping them from ascending, there were also actual dangers that Jean protected them from, and he also helped them with their construction and beautifying projects. So Jean was very much a part of their community, not someone they viewed as a cruel tyrant or bully who stopped them from ascending. They cared about him, which was both a good thing and a bad thing. Because while it meant that he had at least one group in the Ever After he could, if not trust, then at least count on, it also meant that Jean was inevitably going to become attached to them and obsessed with their safety, with how fragile and clumsy they were, as well as innocent. Had the Paper Pleasers gotten angry with him or tried to make him leave, then it would have probably been much easier for Jean to stop and let them ascend. But of course, that wasn't their nature. Their purpose was to help others and tend to the land they lived on. Anger and aggression just wasn't something they possessed. So while the Papers were happy to finally ascend, they weren't angry with Jean for stopping them, and I really hope we can see them again at some point and have them tell him that it's okay, that they're going to be okay, and he can let them go and not worry about them anymore. Which goes back to my point about if they had more time in the volume, they could have had a more satisfactory conclusion to Jean's story with the Paper Pleasers, but I digress. Moving on, let's talk about Jean now. Well, we have been talking about him, but you know what I mean. Actually, I'm not sure what else to say about him, at least not until we get into his argument with RWBY. So much about Jean in this episode was tied into the Paper Pleasers. By talking about them, I've also talked about him. So let's move on to the next topic, RWBY. From the start of the episode, we know that RWBY is struggling. While everyone else is asleep, RWBY lays awake staring at her weapon. Odds are, she's been awake all night and hasn't slept a wink, which could factor into her outburst at the end of the episode. Exhaustion's a bitch. But when the explosion wakes the others up and Jean rushes out of the house, RWBY forgets her weapon and has to go back in to get it. And what Weiss says to her here is very poignant. People are counting on us. That's kind of the whole problem. People are counting on them. On her. RWBY is the leader, not just of Team RWBY, but at this point of their little band of heroes. People are counting on them, but they are counting on her. Being a leader is not easy. If you screw up, something bad can happen to the people relying on you, especially in a situation like theirs where the literal fate of the world is riding on their shoulders. On her shoulders. RWBY is 17. Outside of Oscar, she's the youngest of their group, but paradoxically has the greatest burden out of all of them. And until Volume 7, she was largely coping with it. Because until Volume 7, they were winning and making progress. In Volume 4, Team Ranger reaches Mistral and saves Crow's life. In Volume 5, they secure the lamp and Cinder is supposedly gone. In Volume 6, they save Argus from the Grim, and Ruby uses her silver eyes consciously for the first 2 times, first in the cellars of the farmstead the apathy attacked them in, and second on the Leviathan. And then they fly off in their airship and reach their next destination. And then in Volume 7, everything goes to hell in a handbasket, and it just gets worse in Volume 8. Everything crumbled around them. Their plans were compromised by Cinder using the last question of the lamp, and both Atlas and Mantle were lost, with the people of both cities turned into refugees overnight. Team RWBY plus Jean all fall into the void and wind up in a fantasy world and have to try to find a way back home, where they will be flung back into a struggle that it would seem they can't actually win. And RWBY is the leader, so the pressure of all of this is placed on her and weighs her down more and more as the volume goes on, but her teammates are unaware. Instead, they're focused on getting Yang's arm and RWBY's weapon back, then with getting back to their normal size, then with helping Jean with his burdens and convincing him to let the paper pleasers go. And over all of this is the need to go back to Remnant, because they don't know what's going on back home, and every moment they spend in the Ever After is a moment they aren't back in the fight. And then the Jabberwockers attack, and RWBY is so overwhelmed by everything that's happened up to this point that she can't even bring herself to fight in self-defense. Everyone has a breaking point, and RWBY hits hers. And I think this is a good point to discuss RWBY and Jean's argument. After the Jabberwockers are dealt with, Jean tries to give RWBY's weapon back to her, but she shrinks away from it. This is a very clear sign that something is wrong, but before it can be addressed, the papers finally succeed in one of their, ascension attempts, and breaks the dam, flooding their village and adding a whole extra chapter for the book Jean's therapist is going to be writing on him. And of course, this draws everyone's attention away from RWBY as they comfort Jean over the loss of the paper pleasers. But more than one dam has broken at this point, and when Weiss tries to bring RWBY into comforting Jean, she starts lashing out and venting and asking why she has to be the leader, why she has to be the one to pick other people up. What about her? No time, right? Got to get home, got to help Jean, got to find someone who won't, in her words, screw everything up. Gotta stay positive, or finally sort out our feelings, or mourn Jean's make-believe friends. What RWBY is saying here isn't being fair to anyone, but she isn't trying to be. She's hurt and angry and overwhelmed. She can't take any more of this, and it all just comes out. And the sad part is that if the rest of Team RWBY had taken time to stop and talk to her about it, let her vent and lean on them for a bit rather than them relying on her, a lot of this could have been avoided. But they didn't. At the same time, though, it's not all their fault. Weiss tried to talk to RWBY about Penny, but she turned away. Yang asked RWBY if she was okay after she passed out, but she deflected the question by telling them that Neo was in the Ever After. However, there have definitely been moments where they should have stopped and talked to RWBY, rather than pressing on like they did. Most notably, the moment in the garden after the cat brought up Salem and RWBY came to a halt, and after they met up with RWBY and she still hadn't found the leprechaun nose hairs. Instead of giving RWBY their full attention and checking on her, Blake tells her that they shouldn't think about home right now and should focus on more pressing matters. And Weiss gets on RWBY's case for not getting the last ingredient, just like how she did at the start of this episode for not having her weapon. So I think that overall, RWBY lashing out at them is understandable, even somewhat fair, and something that's been building up in her since the first episode. But then she lashed out at Jean by calling the papers his make-believe friends. And that in turn makes RWBY a target for Jean's own grief and anger, and he lashes back. And no, Jean isn't being fair here, but neither was RWBY, and that's the point. Neither of them are thinking rationally. They're just hurt and angry and venting, and that is completely understandable for both of them after everything they've been through. But they're also lashing out at each other and saying things they don't mean and aren't wholly true or fair, because they aren't thinking clearly here. Grief and sorrow aren't rational things. They don't give you the chance to just quietly wait your turn and treat everyone around you fairly. You can't schedule or plan when you can't take it anymore. And the ways Jean and RWBY explode are both indicative of their characters and a result of how their struggles are shown in the show. RWBY doesn't start screaming and crying. It comes out as vitriolic sarcasm, throwing her teammates' words back in their face as she excises her frustrations with everything. RWBY's build-up to this moment has been more subdued and subtle from episode to episode. Jean, meanwhile, has always been the sort to wear his heart on his sleeve and be more open with his emotions, and we also have only actually had him in the show for 2 episodes thus far, not counting when the Rusted Knight was revealed to be him at the end of episode 5. So we haven't had as much chance to watch the slow buildup of emotions in Jean. Instead, we see his instability in moments like him waking up in a panic, shouting about how he's late as he rushes out of the house, and in sudden emotional outbursts when he says he knows his plan can work, or when he says that the papers are actually folks he can protect. And of course, when Ruby targets him, he explodes, letting out all of his anger, grief, and frustrations in a shouted tirade directed at her. And when Weiss says his name, he snaps out of it and apologizes, saying that he knows he isn't okay, that he isn't right. But how is he supposed to be? He's been alone for so long, trapped in the ever after, trapped on that bridge in that moment, with his sword in his hand, his reflection staring back at him from inside the blade before he takes Penny's life. Something he will have to live with forever, be it in the ever after or back on Remnant. So how is he supposed to be okay? Sure, time heals all wounds, but that only works when you have a chance to heal. Jean hasn't had that chance. He's been alone without anyone to talk to who can understand what he's gone through, stewing in his grief and isolation as he waited for his friends to arrive so they could all go home. Jean never healed from that because he was never given the chance to. And then Blake tries to tell them that it's going to be okay, that things look bad now, but they'll get better. Because in any other situation, that's what Ruby would do. And Blake looks up to Ruby. She is inspired by her. So she tries to do what Ruby would do here and tell them that it's going to be okay. But Ruby doesn't want to hear it. She's tired of saying that things are going to get better when they don't get better. She's tired of pretending that everything is going to be okay because she can't keep doing it anymore. So Ruby leaves. She grabs Crescent Rose and flies off into the distance alone. Well, not alone. She still has Little. Little, who has been with her almost since the start of her journey in the Ever After, and who, no matter what, has always been there for her, even now. Guys, if anything happens to Little in this next episode, I'm going to bawl my eyes out. Update, I bawled my eyes out. But I think that is going to be it for this review, or in this case, perhaps discussion would be a better term. Apologies for the later than usual upload. Something about this episode script just wasn't really clicking for me while I was trying to do it my usual way of breaking down the episode scene by scene. I didn't think to focus on the topics I really wanted to talk about until like Thursday evening, so that kind of reset everything. But despite its delayed upload, I do hope y'all enjoyed this video. What do you think about episode 7? Be sure to leave your thoughts in the comments below, and please, remember to like the video and subscribe for more content like this. I hope you all have a wonderful day, and never forget to keep moving forward. Now I'm gonna work on my review for episode 8. How the fuck am I gonna review episode 8?